Hi, I'm Sam Robinson. I'm a PhD student from the University of Calgary, and I just started my third year of study down in beautiful southern Alberta. Here, I'm originally from Vancouver, so this has been a very interesting learning experience for me, as well as everyone who's around me. So I'm here to talk a bit about canola pollination today, and I have a couple topics that I can talk about. So I've done work in commodity fields and in hybrid seed fields, and I can address either of those topics today. And that's kind of where I want some input from you guys. What are you guys interested in, and what do you want me to talk about, basically? But if you could all come on around here, I have a couple things to start off. So by a show of hands, how many have grown commodity canola here, or have worked with commodity canola? Okay, how about hybrid seed canola? Okay, basically just as many. Okay, so you guys are the experts already then. Okay, so we're gonna go back to the real basics here, and I have a couple pictures I have a picture to. How about I pass one copy around? And then I will just demonstrate the other one here. So let's go back. To grade school. Let's learn about flower pollination. So here we have a cartoon of a canola flower, right? Now flowers are typically hermaphroditic, so that's a perfect flower. So it has both male and female parts to it, right? So the anthers are here, and their job is to produce pollen, which gets transported to the stigma, and the stigma is the female part here, which receives the pollen. So then in things like this, the pollen gets stuck on there, and then the stigma actually waters it, so that it exudes water, and then the pollen grows a pollen tube all the way down the style to the ovules. So the ovules are what will become seeds in the future. And typically the ovule number in most plants is set, so it's a fixed number. But that can change throughout the season. So sometimes plants will produce flowers with less ovules later on or earlier on. So now the transport here. Now let's make this a little bit interactive. So how can you guys think of ways that pollen might go to another plant or to the same plant? Wind. Okay, very good. Okay, wind. So that's one. What else? Okay, we got bees or insects more generally. Anything else? Humans, yeah. If someone goes there with a paintbrush and does hand pollination, yep, could do that. Birds, ooh, that's interesting. Not in canola, but yes, there's some kinds of tropical plants that have birds that pollinate them. But no, there's the other one I was thinking of was just shaking back and forth. So you see how near the anthers are to the stigma. In this case, in canola, it starts off where the stigma is actually quite a bit lower than the anthers. So it's what we call protandrous. So now I'm sure you guys are all familiar with canola flowers here. Let me see if I can find one that's just come out. So you can see this one has just come out, and the stigma in there is still buried underneath of the anthers, right? So this one's probably about maybe a day old, might have come out yesterday afternoon, that kind of a thing. So the way that protandrous plants work is that the stigma will push past the anthers, and then that sort of provides an assurance of pollination, or that's kind of one of the strategies that these plants can use to assure that they get pollinated in time. Because when the stigma goes past the anthers, then it brushes into them and gets pollen deposited on them. So that's what we call self-pollination, right? And the other one is cross-pollination. So that's where you get pollen from one plant going to the stigma of another plant. And that can also happen. That usually is done by either wind or by bees. In commodity canola, or in canola in general, the pollen is usually very, very sticky and dense. So not a whole lot goes on by the wind. So most of that is either accomplished either by bees or it goes on within itself. Okay, so that's the basics of commodity canola pollination. And then once the stigma gets higher, then it's only receptive to pollen from other plants at that point. Now, as it gets higher, the petals will dehisce and they fall off. I'm sure you guys have all seen this. and this stigma will elongate, and those ovules will swell. They get sugar from the rest of the plant, and they will turn into fully formed seeds. And then eventually they develop oil, and then that becomes the pods in, potted commodity canola, right? So this all started off as a stigma that was maybe only half a centimeter long, kind of like that. Okay, so there's the basics of commodity canola pollination. Now, let's see, what else? So what are some other things that these plants produce besides just pollen? Nectar, yes. Nectar is important. It serves as an attractant for bees. So if some plants don't make any nectar, and they just rely on being pretty, but usually bees will figure that out pretty quickly, and they want some kind of a reward to that. But yeah, there's nectar produced. It's not in the cartoon here, but it's produced down at these little green, there's these little sort of green blobs down at the bottom of the stigma. And I can actually show you that here. So you can see this too if you pull off the petals. And you can see here, this one actually has some drops of nectar forming here. So pull off the sepals as well. There we go. Yeah, so there's one of the sepals. So there's the little green dot down there. So those are the nectaries of canola. So you can see those at the base of the flower there. And canola nectar is usually very thick. So there's a sepal, and that little green dot down there is the nectary. So canola nectar is usually pretty thick. It's about 60% sugar. And one flower can produce about 1 microliter of nectar. That's sort of the standing crop that we're looking at in a lot of these things. But that translates into, that's only one flower. And over the entire crop, that can translate into about 320 liters of nectar in a quarter section of canola. So that is quite a substantial amount of nectar, especially for things like bees that are visiting it, right? So in this way, canola is actually quite a good honey source, and most of the honey produced well, maybe not most, but a significant chunk of the honey that's produced in southern Alberta comes from canola. So yes, so canola, you can have benefits from bees or benefits to the bees. Now let me just check my notes here to see what I was going to talk about next. And also the lovely wind that started to kick up. Here we go. Let's see, dehiscence. Right, so the varieties of canola. So most canola that's grown up here is Argentine canola, or Brassica napus. And there are herbicide-tolerant varieties of this available. And then an older variety on other species is Polish canola, or Brassica rapa. That was more grown here kind of back in the 80s and the 70s as far as I can make out. And it's still grown in some parts of northern Alberta because it tends to pod fairly quickly, and it's a bit more shatter resistant too. So it's better for that kind of thing. Now the main question, now let's go back to this here again. So what problems might arise if we have a plant that's pollinating itself? Sort of. It's technically sexual reproduction, but asexual would be like it would be like if you chop the plant in half and then plant one some other place. But so you could get inbreeding depression. So that's one thing that a lot of folks worry about in a lot of these plants is inbreeding depression. So inbreeding depression happens when you get deleterious alleles, so different genes that cause bad things to happen, paired up together. And that happens much more frequently if you have something that's very related to it. And in this case, this is sort of the most intense case of inbreeding, is where it's actually able to mate with itself, or with close relatives as well. Now, most Argentine canola is self-compatible. So what happens there is that when the pollen goes onto the stigma, it's able to fully grow a pollen tube down to the ovules. If a plant is self-incompatible, what happens is that pollen tube stops halfway, or it doesn't even get started. So Brassica rapa or Polish canola, that's typically self-incompatible, meaning that this doesn't work, or the pollen that results or that ends up on the stigma from itself, nothing happens to that. So meaning that it has to have cross-pollination going on. So there's one of the other main points is the benefits of bees are not homogeneous across all canola either. So its variety is important, and the type of canola, whether it's Polish or Argentine. And in some Polish canola, what they've historically done is used what's called synthetic varieties, where they blend two different types of seed in the seeder, and then that produces multiple different kinds of plants. And so if you have different kinds of plants out in the field, they're more able to pollinate each other. So that's kind of the first part of my talk. So does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. All right, well, we'll move on right to the second part, which is seed canola pollination. So seed canola pollination, it's done much less in terms of acreage across all of Canada, and most of it's done here in Alberta. So seed canola pollination looks a little bit different. So we're going to play a little bit of a spot the difference game here. What can you see that is different about these two things?
Self-pollination is missing.
Yes, there's no self-pollination. Okay, anything else?
Don't they self-pollinate?
The commodity does, but this is seed canola.
Yeah.
There's no antler.
There we go. Excellent. $1 for this man. Okay, so there's no anther there. So there are two types. So there are two types of plants that are planted in seed canola pollination. There are what they call the male plants. So these are the ones they have both. Well, technically they're hermaphrodites. They have both male and female parts to them. And then there are the female plants. So the female plants have a gene called POL that is present in the cytoplasm that stops the anther from forming, or it produces these sort of shriveled small anthers that don't make any real pollen. So now the reason that they do this is because they want to know the parentage. They want the seeds from this to be a cross of this plant and this plant. So the reason that they have the gene in there is it stops self-pollination in this one, and then this one there's what's called a restorer gene in here. So then the restorer gene is able to cancel out the gene that turns off the anthers, and the seeds that are created from this become the seeds that you plant for commodity. Okay? So this is if you buy seeds from Bayer or DeKalb, then this is how they make the seeds here. And but in order to do this, you need to get cross-pollination to go on. It's no longer sufficient to just get self-pollination. In fact, with the male plants, they either spray them or they cut them down at the end of the season, and then those get thrown out. So these plants aren't the ones that aren't even wanted. So it's only these ones. So now I'm going to pass a couple pictures around of what these seed fields look like. So you guys, if you've driven through sort of Tabor or Scandia or Vauxhall, that sort of area during most summers, you should see things that kind of look like this. So let's pass one this way, one going the other way. We can pass one here, and then maybe one here. So they get around this problem by planting the plants in bays. So now you'll see this a bit more clearly when this picture comes around, but they actually have bays of females and bays of males. And the male bays are much thinner than the female bays, so they usually only plant those about 3 feet wide. And then the female bays, the width of them can vary. They can go anywhere from like 18 to, I've seen some with, 25 kind of a thing. It varies, and it also varies depending on the company as well. So they have people whose job it is to figure out what the optimal width of those bays is. But you can see how it creates this kind of a stripy effect here. Now I've outlined this with dots here, but if you ever drive out by those areas and you see these kind of stripy fields, that's what you're looking at. So now the female bay here needs you need to get pollen from the male bay over to the female bay. And since I mentioned that brassica pollen is pretty sticky and doesn't really get transported by wind, what's going to happen? What's the solution to this then?
Okay, that's where the bees come in.
This is where the bees come in. Excellent. Okay, very good. Yes. So now there are two types of bees that are used for this. So now you guys are probably thinking of just honeybees, but there's another kind of bee that they use for this as well. So I'm going to pass another set of pictures around here. Oh, well, you've already got that set coming around. So now here's one of those stripy fields. This I think is out by no, where is this by? Bow Island. Yes, it's out by Bow Island. No, this is by Hayes actually. But yes, so they have honeybees on the side of the fields here. So now beekeepers will come during the night. They pick up the beehives during the night, and they will drop them on the sides of the field there. And then when the bees wake up in the morning, they find themselves in a completely different place. They're not very happy for the first couple days, but then they figure out what the area looks like, and they get to work pollinating. And leafcutters. Now leafcutter bees are a little bit different than honeybees. Leafcutters they don't have a queen. They're solitary, and they live in these little shelters out here. So I'm going to pass one more picture around of a leafcutter shelter. So this is a picture of a leafcutter bee shelter. So it's these sort of orange tents. And then this is what they look like from the outside. And then inside they have these foam boards. So you can see these boards in here. And those boards are punched full of holes. And the holes the leafcutters will make homes in. And I will show you a little bit. Well, I can actually pass this around. So this is sort of what the foam boards look like. This one's made out of wood. They're usually made out of styrofoam, though. And what the leafcutters do is, like their namesake, they cut small pieces of leaves out, and they will find these holes, and then they'll roll up the leaves into sort of like mini cigar-shaped little cocoons. And then the females will go and stuff pollen and nectar into there in sort of a ball, or they call it a pollen loaf. And then they will lay an egg on it, and then move on and make another one, right? So those are leafcutter cocoons, and I have some here. So I will pass some of these around. So these are leafcutter cocoons. Yeah. I don't know if you want a shot of this, but... Yes, so there are dead leafcutters in there as well. Yeah. So these are leafcutter cocoons, and you can see that they're made out of leaves. And some of them you can actually see that there are little sort of paler leaves in there as well. Do you know what those are? They're not leaves, those are petals of canola flowers. Yes. So occasionally if they can't find leaves, then they will go for flowers. I can hold still for a picture here. If any of you guys want pictures or anything like that, all of this will be available afterwards as well. Okay, well.
Thank you.
Okay. In fact, I'll pass this around so people can take a bit of a look at it.
That's very tempting to use that.
All right. And leafcutters do a little bit. They pollinate a little bit differently too. Honeybees, they're all female, or the workers are all female, and they are only interested in pollen and nectar. So they're only interested in bringing it back to their hive. The leafcutters are both male and female out there. The males are interested in, well, they're interested in the females primarily, but they're also interested in nectar as well. Now, if you look at these flowers again, now you can see what the male and the female plants, they're a little bit different, but the female plant only has one thing to offer, which is, so this one has pollen and nectar, and what does the female plant have? Just nectar, correct. So it only has nectar in there. It has no anthers. So that means that they forage in very different ways on these different plants. And yes, that's let me look at what I had to say next here. Yeah. Well, okay. So those are leafcutters, but why don't we yeah, that's basically it for leafcutters. But why don't we take a look at why don't we go take a look at some honeybees, and then we will come back here. Does that sound good? Okay, I have a smaller set of hives, or I have a smaller hive over there. There's no actual bees in the hive. So, okay. So this is a single here. So a single just means a single brood chamber on the bottom. And this is what most beekeepers start off the year with, is one of these guys. So they have a lid.
For honeybees?
This is for honeybees. That's correct.
Oh,
Okay,
there's
so we're
no live bees in there.
no, there are no bees. No, there are no bees present in this box. Yes. Yeah, it's over. So I'll pull out a frame to show you guys here. All right. So this is comb with honey on it. Some of them are uncapped. But now many things can be stored in honeycomb. The most obvious one would be honey, but what else do you think?
Pollen,
Pollen, yes. There can be pollen stored in here.
brood.
Then there's brood. Yep. Anything else? Anything else? Yes. In some cases there are mites. But in fact, I will actually pass this around so that you guys can take a look at this yourself.
How do they get in and out of the box?
So they get in and out of the box. There's usually an entrance either on the top or on the bottom. This one has.
Oh, I see.
This one has this is an entrance reducer so that they can only come in through those 3 points. But yes, they come in through the bottom there. And let me see if I can find some other example ones.
What do they do with the bees the other 11 and a half months?
They actually start in April.
That one
Yeah.
The first of this dandelion where they go on.
Okay.
Yeah. Down here at least. Yeah.
And they go till October, November.
Yeah.
Do the bees go back to the same spot? Like, do they know? Like, do they go home?
Do the honeybees? Yes, the honeybees have
Better.
the honeybees have a very keen sense of that.
What I mean is, if there were 6 boxes out, would they go to the same
Yeah,
one that they
no,
came out of?
yeah.
Well, most of the time they sometimes get lost. If the boxes look all the same, then they can get lost. Usually they don't. They're pretty good about that. But occasionally when you're looking in here, you know, and bees can also have different skin tones as well. You can have blonde bees, you can have dark ones or tiger ones, which are more kind of orangey and black. So occasionally, if you have a blonde hive, and then you'll see a really dark one running around in there, and it's like, oh, where did that worker come from? This one must be lost.
So where do they store them like through winter? Do the sheds then, or what?
Some of them, yep. Most beekeepers just keep them outside. They wrap them up with landscaping fabric. They have an entrance at the top so that they can get out through the snow, and then they just overwinter out there. What some honey producers will do is put them in climate-controlled warehouses. So then they'll stack them up. They'll stack up the singles, and they'll keep them cold enough for them to stay inside, but not so cold that they start dying. Let me see. I was going to try to show you guys a queen cell here, if I could. But oh yeah, these are. As you can see, this is not a very healthy hive. Those are wax moths in there.
Why is it so dark?
Why is the comb so dark?
Yeah.
Because it's very old. So new comb, if you can, let me see if I can show you what new comb looks like. Here we
So
go.
if there was brood in there, they get darker.
Yeah.
The honey frames, they like keep
Yeah.
lighter color.
So this is mainly foundation here. So foundation is a set of hexagonal cells that they produce that you can buy to install in these frames. And then this is new comb in here that they've started making. So if the bees see a hexagon pattern, they'll just start making comb of that size around it. And you need different sizes of comb to produce different sizes of workers as well. Let's see here. Here we go. So those are the beginnings of queen cells here. So you can see these cells are a little bit more kind of protruded from the comb. So that's the start of a queen cell. Queen cells are longer. They're also called swarm cells. And that happens when there's too many workers in there, and they need to start reproducing, or they need to start moving shop. That's a queen cell. Yeah. 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 And oh yeah. Yep. You guys can feel free to. I'll leave this apart. Since there's no real bees in there right now, so I'll leave this apart so you guys can take pictures of these afterwards if you want. But then typically they don't just stay in one box. Usually you'll see boxes that are stacked multiple ones up on top of each other. So they'll start putting what are called honey supers in. And honey supers are deeper frames that hold honey for them. And in between the in between the bottom box and the honey supers, they'll put this thing, which is called a queen excluder. So a queen excluder is large enough that a worker can pass through, but too big for a queen. And what that means is the queen can't get up here, so that means she can't lay any eggs up in the top boxes. That means that the top boxes only have honey in them. And speaking of queens, so most of the queens that we get are from Hawaii, actually. Queens that are not made around here. Most of the beekeepers buy queens from Hawaii. They come in these little boxes. You can order them through Canada Post, and assuming they're not on strike. And queens cost about $30 each. So if you if you lose your queens, then that represents a cost on their part. Similarly, if you lose a colony and you have to get a new package of bees, most of the packaged bees come from New Zealand. So they used to be able to import bees from the United States, but that got canned in the late 80s because of disease concerns. And in fact, a method that they used to do for beekeeping out on the prairies was they would buy a package of bees from the States and then kill them all with insecticides at the end of the year because it wasn't worth the cost of them overwintering. So yeah, so that was one method. We don't do that anymore because it's not it's not economically viable. Yeah, but a beekeeper who's asked to pollinate seed canola typically charges around $170 for a hive, and seed canola is stocked usually at around 1 hive per acre. So that's about, that's about 130 hives. Usually it's a little bit higher. It's usually kind of around 160, that sort of thing. But again, this depends on the company and depends on how they organized it with the growers as well.
Now, what do you call a hive? Is this a hive or
Yes.
is this the stack a hive?
Both of those.
It's just a brood box.
Yeah, so this
Yeah,
is just,
for two together. That's starting to be a hive.
so this is a single.
So if you have 4 or 5, that's 1 hive.
Yeah.
The 4 is the 1 hive.
Yeah. But so if they pollinate seed canola, they actually have to get they have in their contract there's a specification about they have to have such and such number of frames in a hive with such and such an amount of workers, right? Because if you get a hive that's just a single, then that's not really any use to them. So they need to be of a certain size or bigger. And then leaf cutters cost about $100 for a gallon of those cocoons. And they typically use about 2 gallons an acre. So that's about 26 grand to pollinate an entire field of seed canola there. And let's see, what else here?
What did you say about the leaf cutters?
The leaf cutters cost about $100 a gallon. And they typically use about 2 gallons per acre. So it's around $26,000 to pollinate just for the leaf cutters. And then 160 times 170 for the honeybees. So you can see that this is all working up to be a great amount of cost on the part of the seed companies. All right, so now you guys know all about leafcutter bees. You guys know all about honeybees. Let's go learn about some wild bees back at the table. This is a little smaller, so if you guys come on in a little bit here. So not all bees. So I just mentioned 2 species of bees there. So leafcutter bees and honeybees. But there are about 500 species of bees in Alberta in total, and those are only 2 of them. Now there's a whole slew of wild bees that live in Alberta too. So now you guys can look at these more carefully afterwards, but I've organized them by family on this side and then genus going across here. So now you guys are probably familiar with bumblebees. So bumblebees are the big fuzzy ones like that.
Jumbos.
Yes, exactly.
Did you catch all these yourself?
Yes. Well, the bumblebees, one of my assistants caught up near Grand Prairie. But the rest of these I caught all myself. Yeah, so there's a lot of very, very small ones. So those are Hylaeus. Hylaeus means from the woods. So they're typically found near more kind of woody areas. But you guys can come around and see. You guys can come around and inspect these later. But most of these are from all around here. In fact, some of these are from just down the road near Coaldale here. And you can see from the locality label where all of these species came from. But these are mainly all from kind of around Tabor, Raymond, Vauxhall, Scandia, that sort of area, which is where I was working last year. Okay, So now, so these guys, most of them are not social as well. Bumblebees are the exception. They're social. They have a queen. So that what the bumblebee life cycle looks like is the queen will emerge in the spring, and then she'll go out and find a burrow, usually of like a ground squirrel or a gopher or something like that, and then she'll set up camp there. So she'll start making comb. Bumblebee comb looks different than honeybee comb. Bumblebee comb looks kind of more like a series of wax bubbles that are all attached to each other. So it looks a little bit more kind of like something out of a science fiction film. But then the bumblebee queen will go in there, she'll start making comb, she'll start laying eggs, and then she'll go out and start harvesting nectar and pollen herself. And then she'll bring it back and provision her kids with it. And then once they've grown into adults, she becomes a stay-at-home mom. And after that, she just sends her kids out to do the work. So then the workers, so you can see a very small one over there, so that's a worker bee. And then the bigger ones are queens in there, and then there's a drone right up there. So a drone is a male bee. And then sort of around July, the colony starts producing reproductives, which are either male, like drone bees, or new queens. And those ones will come out of the hive, and the males will mate with the females, and then the females usually overwinter underground or under a rock or a log, places like this, and then they come out the next year and repeat the same cycle. So now bumblebees do not reuse the same hive though, and they do produce honey, but it's in very small amounts. So they produce just kind of enough for themselves, and they don't produce enough to last from year to year, which is why bumblebee honey is so hard to find in the supermarkets. Now the rest of these, they have a similar life cycle. They're kind of more similar to the leafcutter bees actually. So the rest of these are mainly all solitary. So what they'll do is a similar thing to the leafcutters. The females you'll usually dig a hole in the ground, like if in the andrenids, the mining bees, and then they will stuff a pollen loaf, so a mixture of nectar and pollen, into the bottom of this, lay an egg on it, and then repeat the process until their life is over, basically. So they never meet their children. And then the kids will come out. They'll go through their larval stages and pupate, and then they'll emerge from the soil as adults the next year and complete the cycle. So that's how the life cycle of a solitary bee works. Now the bottom there are not actually bees, those are syrphid flies. So syrphid flies are also known as hover flies. They have a bit of a different life cycle. Their young are maggots, so they'll either live underground or underwater, like in ditches, or they'll live on plants. And the maggots are usually carnivorous. So they eat aphids, they eat midge larvae, they'll eat whatever they can find. And then the adults, then they'll pupate and turn into adults, and then the adults feed on nectar. So then the adults feed on nectar and they'll visit flowers, and then they'll lay their eggs, and that's how that life cycle goes. Okay, so now you guys know all about wild bees or wild pollinators in general in southern Alberta. Any questions? Any questions?
What's in that jar?
This jar. So this is canola pollen. Yeah, I'll pass this around. So this is canola pollen that was collected from a pollen trap on a honeybee hive. So how a pollen trap works is the door that goes into the honeybee hive, it's usually wide enough that the bee can go in, and since they carry their pollen on their legs, if you make the door a little bit smaller, then the pollen will actually get brushed off. And you can get a special thing called a pollen trap, where it brushes off the pollen into a basket below. And this has been collected for scientific reasons. We're trying to figure out how much pollen they're bringing in at different times of the year, depending on what crops are around. But yeah, that's canola pollen right there.
How long would it take to collect that quantity?
That quantity? Ooh, depends on the pollen flow. Canola produces quite a bit of pollen. Like that would maybe be a day or two for a big colony. Well, a large honeybee colony can have 50,000 workers in it. So.
Do you test it for insecticides or residue too, and the honey?
That's in the plan. Yep.
Okay.
So, but that's that's in the plan there. Okay, so let's see here. What else are we going to talk about? Okay, so now I'll talk a bit about the relationship to commodity production. So the relationship to seed production is very straightforward. They need honeybees. If there are no bees or no leaf cutters, then there's no seeds made. So that's not debatable. That's just how it is. With commodity production, I'm kind of interested actually. What have you guys heard about commodity production in honeybees? Anyone? Anyone? Well, there's a couple kind of papers that are out there. And this has been studied for quite a while. Older varieties of canola generally they benefit from pollination. So this is commodity canola we're talking about, not seed. Older varieties of commodity canola generally benefit from honeybee or other bee, wild bee, pollination. However, for newer varieties, and especially for the ones that have been used since the early 2000s, that relationship is a little less clear. There's a couple studies that have shown that if you have a seed field or a commodity field near to wild sources of insects, like near to a strip of forest or to a strip of pasture, then you actually get more pollen deposition on the side nearer to the source of the wild insects. Now, whether that translates into increased yield is a little funny, and this is actually kind of what I'm researching as well. Is how commodity can or may benefit from wild pollination. But in general, it's not really thought that it's that necessary. I mean, most people don't stock their fields with honeybees, and the yields are fairly fine. But there are a couple studies out there that have found that that they ripen faster closer to the hives, or that they have increased seed size per pod, or seed size or seed number per pod. And that's sort of what I'm investigating to figure out whether that trend is real and whether that translates into yield at the farm scale or at the field scale. But other than that, there's certainly not really a downside to having bees on your field. So I would suggest if you have a beekeeper who wants to keep bees on your commodity field for honey production, I would say that's a good idea. I would also say ask him for some honey, because canola makes quite a bit of honey, so that should be part of the deal at least.
But then you need at least 17 bushel more yield to pay for $170 for the hive.
Yes, yes. So you would need So if the yield is that's a very good point. But most beekeepers don't charge for putting bees on commodity fields.
Well, in this area, I think they're smart enough that they do.
Oh yeah, on commodity. Well, most of them are kind of like the ones that are used for honey production anyway. The ones that don't get moved into seed, I've usually seen them on ditch sides and stuff like that. But that of course depends on whether it's their land to get put on.
What about legumes, fava beans, for instance?
I've read a couple papers on that. Fava beans, I'm not so sure about. Soybeans, I've heard that you get slightly increased yields, but again, it's a question of scale for this thing too, right? I mean, if you have a quarter section which is 160 acres, I think, like that's a lot of bees you would need in order to pollinate it that well, and paying for 160 hives to go on a small quarter section like that, whether it's actually worth it is a little suspect in my mind.
And what about the quality of the nectar and the pollen in soybeans and other crops that we grow?
That is not very well known as far as I can tell. Soybeans or fava beans don't produce a huge amount of nectar. Mm-hmm. Most of them can self-pollinate as far as I can tell. Mm-hmm. So most of the honey and pollen flow for these things comes off of either alfalfa, sweet clover, which is in ditches, or canola. Those are kind of the main crops. Sometimes you get the bringing in pollen from corn. And corn pollen has like sort of a very light, sort of straw colored to it. But most of it, to be honest, in southern Alberta comes from canola and alfalfa. And those are actually very high quality honeys too, because they're very nice and clear.
But it crystallizes very quick.
It does. And so you have to pasteurize. So I actually have. I'm not sure if we have enough here, but for anyone who's interested, I have some honey sticks. If anyone would like some honey sticks.
Bribing with candy, that's a good
Yes,
idea.
exactly, yeah. See, bribery can get you somewhere.
The different sources for the different colors?
Yes, the dark one is a wildflower, and the yellowish is a clover honey. So, yeah. But let's see if I had anything else left in my talk here. Yeah. Oh, actually, that was another interesting point. So, me and my colleagues, we work in Shelley Hoover's lab out here at the research center. I'm studying how far. Well, part of my research is how far bees go into a field, because I think I was explaining to someone here. It's kind of like if you go to say there's a Tim Hortons near to you, but you know that the lineup is very, very long, it might be worth your while to go a little bit further. Another sort of interesting question about, or another sort of interesting analogy is how far do you go for gas? You know, if you live in Lethbridge and gas is 5 cents cheaper out in Coaldale, is it worth your time and effort to go out there? And this is a question that honeybees and other type of foraging social insects have to ask themselves when they go out and forage. And that plays into how far they should go into a field, because if you have an unstocked field and then you plop a honeybee hive there, they'll go to the first thing that they see. But eventually, if everyone's going to that, then the lineup at Tim Hortons becomes a little too long, right? And then it becomes worth it for them to go a little bit further. And then if that lineup gets too long, then they go a little bit further, right? So this is kind of the process that I'm actually studying in commodity and seed fields, is how far do they go into the field, and because the other kind of main question about this is even if you stock a field very well, what about the center of the field? Maybe they're just pollinating all around the edges, and then the center of the field is untouched by honeybees. So that's kind of one thing that I'm kind of researching, just as a plug for my own research here. So.
But that's what I always wonder. We have mostly pivot round fields here, circle fields. Why they don't put the honeybees in the center?
It's hard to get them in there. That's basically the answer, and it's inconvenient for the beekeepers too.
That's the biggest reason.
Yeah, because typically they have to go in there at night. So when they're putting these beehives on a seed field, they'll go in there at night. So they get up. So this is, if you ever see a beekeeper who's very tired during the summer, this is probably why, because they have to. They start work around kind of like 9 or 10 at night, and then they go till around 4 in the morning. And when they're transporting hives in.
But when they take the honey, they do that in the daytime.
Yeah, for the honey they do it in the daytime. But if they tried to transport these during the day, then bad things would happen. Well, the bees get lost and they get much more angry. But that's sort of the basic thing. But that's exactly why you don't see bees in the middle of the field. In other areas of the world, like down in Argentina and Chile, where labor costs are much lower, they actually will put beehives into the center of the field, or they'll space the beehives like very evenly around the field instead of putting them all at one corner of the field. But that's basically why you don't see that here. But that's sort of most of my talk here. Does anyone else have any questions?
In your opinion, what's the sort of state of the union health-wise of the natural pollinators in Western Canada?
That's a good question. That's it really depends on the species. Bumblebees are not looking so good, especially in areas down here that are fairly arid. But a lot of that is very hard to tell because, before we started large-scale agriculture here, this would have been basically a desert area, right? And deserts have large diversities of bees, but it's not these kinds. And there were very few people studying what insects were around back then too. So it's kind of this classic problem. We have very bad records of it, and then we're trying to study very large-scale patterns at the same time. But for bumblebees, generally they need a bit more of a larger area, and they need earlier forage crops as well. So in order to start up a bumblebee colony, they need not just 2 weeks of canola in the middle. They also need flowers in May when they're first going. And I think you were mentioning that dandelions are one of their preferred crops for honeybees as well, actually. So there's actually quite a large role of wild plants in this. So even just wild roses in the ditch or sweet clover kind of around this time of year, that all acts as sort of an alternate forage source. So that would be one thing if people are interested in cultivating or in promoting wild bees on their farm is maybe think about if you have a pivot and the corners are just bare, maybe think about keeping wild grass there, that kind of a thing. Or maybe not mowing down the flowers in the ditches too often during the spring, at least when they're building up their brood stock. So that's kind of my take on it at this point anyway.
Can you comment on the health of honeybees in Western Canada?
Western Canada, very good. Yeah.
Eastern Canada as well, if you'd like.
Eastern Canada, pretty much is as far as now. That's not a huge area of my research, but from what I know is out in Alberta, we have essentially no colony collapse. It's actually kind of debatable whether we ever had it in Canada to begin with. So you guys may have heard of this issue of colony collapse. So that happened around sort of the mid 2000s, starting in Ontario, and they started noticing similar patterns in other places, where the colonies would basically just disappear during the winter. And it's been tied a lot to pesticides. The ones in Canada were basically tied to improper pesticide application. So they had neonicotinoid seed treatments for corn that were improperly bound to the seed. So that the pesticide. So when you have treated seeds, they have the blue coating around them, right? These ones weren't adhered very. They hadn't been properly bound to the seed. So when they went to plant, all of this neonic dust got kicked up, and bees will gather pollen and dust that they see as well, and they were brushing that into their corbicula and storing that with the rest of the pollen, and they were not doing so well because of it. I mean, these things are these are insecticides, right? That problem has basically disappeared, and they haven't really had. I mean, there's die-offs every year just because the winters are cold in Canada, right? The question is whether there's abnormally high die-offs, and as far as I can tell, we don't really have a huge problem with that. In fact, the last couple winters in Alberta have been pretty good for it because there's less die-offs. So, in the States, that's another question, but I could talk for way more about it if we want to talk about the States, though.
But then the honeybee is not natural in North America.
No,
right?
it's not. Yeah.
It's
Does
an
anyone?
import.
Do you know where they're from?
Well,
Probably Holland.
Asia.
Oh, of course. Everything good's from Holland.
Nothing good comes from Holland.
No, these are mainly Italian and German honeybees. So it's Apis mellifera mellifica, I believe, is the subspecies of these, and Ligusta. But these are mainly from Germany and Italy. And but Apis mellifera, the genus or the species of honeybee, exists all over the world. So most of the Apis species are from Africa. They build much smaller colonies and they're much more aggressive over there. Which is why if you cross them with the colonies that we have, which are bigger and more gentle, you get really big colonies that are also really aggressive, and those are called
Killer bees.
yes. So those are killer bees, and those they tried those out in South America back in the 80s, and they escaped and started setting up their own colonies in the wild. But the killer bee problem has basically been dealt with. They've essentially bred most of the aggression out of them, and now they have these bees that are very robust and healthy. So killer bees they're actually very healthy bees. So they have less diseases in there, and they make massive amounts of honey. But they don't do so good in the winters here. So they kind of stop sort of around Florida or Texas, and they start dying after latitudes further north of that. So yeah.
You mentioned with the leaf cutters that because you have male and female, right? They
Yep.
behave differently, especially in like hybrid seed production.
Yes.
So I was just wondering, is there the honeybees tend to pollinate better because with the males in the leaf cutters just go to the female only flowers?
No, that's a very good question. Yeah, that's actually one of my other colleagues, Riley, is studying that right now. The main difference between that's a question, or that's what we call pollination efficacy. So if you have a flower that's never been visited and a bee, a leafcutter or a honeybee comes and visits it, the number of pollen grains that it deposits, that's called pollination efficacy. It's like a per visit measure of how many pollen grains are deposited. Now, honeybees are actually way worse for pollination efficacy. So in per visits, they don't deposit nearly as much pollen as leafcutter bees. And part of that is because leafcutter bees, I'll open up the box here and show you what they look like here. Leafcutter bees, they don't store their pollen in the same way. So leafcutter bees have a fuzzy stomach. I'll come around with this guy. So this is a wild leafcutter. So you can see the bottom of their abdomen there, and it's all fuzzy. So leafcutter bees store all of their pollen down on the bottom of their abdomen like this. And honeybees store it on the rest of their body, but honeybees are especially good at cleaning up after themselves. So they tend to brush themselves off a lot more and pack it into corbicula, which are these little pollen baskets that you see on their legs. So you see these guys? And these leafcutters don't do that, which means that per visit, leafcutters are actually far superior to honeybees. The only problem with leafcutter bees is that they're very expensive, for one thing, and they also don't travel as far as honeybees. So leafcutter bees, from their shelter, they maybe only travel maybe 100 meters from their shelter. So their world is much smaller than honeybees. They don't think of things. They don't go across the field. Like a honeybee will travel like 2 kilometers. They can go like 4 kilometers for a foraging trip. Some of them have even been found longer at like distances of 10 kilometers away from their hive. So honeybees can travel very far, and this is why in seed production they kind of need both. Because the honeybees provide, they can go for long distances, so they can go all the way to the pivot, and they don't even feel it. Whereas leafcutters, they get much more. They don't go that far, basically. But then, so it's kind of a trade-off of how many honeybees we should have versus how many leafcutter bees we should have. But those are some of the aspects associated with that, I would say. Another kind of weird thing you can get is that a lot of these focus on one thing. So in a single trip, a honeybee typically either gathers only pollen or nectar. So now you can see why that might be a problem when you want them to go to both types of, flowers. All right, so you want them to jump back and forth. Often they don't, but if you put enough bees on a field, you'll get enough crossings. You'll get enough crossing going on that actually will go on. So, yeah, does that kind of answer your question a bit, or yeah? All right. Not sure how I'm doing
No,
for
you're
time
good.
here.
I think
Okay.
we'll wrap it up.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Sam. It was very interesting. Join me in thanking him.